Shalom Kulam. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and welcome to the latest in our Zoom series. We've had a lengthy break with the Chagim and the summer and other things, but it's good to be back. For those that are new to this, I'll have a conversation for about half an hour with our guest, and then open it up to questions. You can write the questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go from there. So a lot's happened in the world since we last met. Perhaps nothing more significant and more important globally, and perhaps, as we're about to discuss, for our region, than the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan after 20 years of military engagement there following the 9/11 attacks. And we're going to discuss, a lot's been written about that, both in the US and elsewhere, much critical of the decision or of the way it was done. And we maybe we'll get to that as well. But what we're going to talk about is very specifically how it impacts Israel and the Middle East more broadly. And to do that, we're very happy to welcome back Helit Barel, who spoke to us about Iran and the JCPOA some months ago. Helit Barel is the former executive director of the Council for Peace and Security. She served in recent years as a member of its executive board. She was formerly a director at the National Security Council of Israel, heading the U.S. Israeli bilateral desk. Prior to that, she worked at the Congressional Research Service in Washington, authoring several reports for Congress on issues related to weapons of mass destruction, and at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, also in Washington, D.C. Helit is a founding member and former executive board member of the Devorah Forum, which is for women in foreign policy and national security, and at the Israel Nuclear Forum. She is a BA from Hebrew University, an MA in public policy from Harvard. And Helit, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So let's just start with a sort of general question. As I said, a lot's been written about and spoken about the American decision to withdraw. And I think much of the concern, certainly from some quarters in the United States and also from America's allies, has been whether this decision by President Biden speaks to a general direction that America is moving in, and perhaps has been moving in from Obama through Trump to Biden, of a withdrawal of America from its engagement, specifically military engagement in the wider world, and what that would mean for the Middle East. Can we start with that one?
Sure. Yes. So first of all, as you mentioned, this American decision, or Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, can almost be seen or said to be inevitable. I mean, it is far from being a surprise. Putting aside the question of how and when it was executed, there's been a very long arc over all the administrations of pivoting out of the Middle East. I don't see it, certainly not for the Biden administration, and certainly wasn't for Obama, as disengaging from world affairs or going back to any kind of isolation, but as a very long and I must say probably reasonable American inclination in its foreign policy to pivot towards Asia and out of the Middle East. So I think this is just a very logical step in that arc of movement towards Asia. I can share with you on a private note that in 2005, approximately, I spoke to somebody from the Pentagon who told me And this is when the United States, it was in the midst of Iraq and Afghanistan, like at the very height of everything and very close still after 9/11. Some from the Pentagon told me, yes, but this is all a distraction. This is not what's important. What's important is China and Asia. So this is far from being a new sentiment. It's a very well-based one. And so it can't really be viewed much as a surprise in the substance of this, this idea. And the question, of course, though, is what did this mean for the region and what it means for great power play, and for us, ultimately, what it means for Israel. But still on the American level, I think one of the takeaways that should have been taken away probably before, but it's time after time, is this failure in nation building, this inability really to, unfortunately, import values and institutions and just implant them elsewhere. I mean, we'll see, the jury's still out on what will happen in Iraq, but so far it doesn't seem to be a huge success story, with the exceptions of what happened in Germany and Japan after World War II, but that's a very long time ago and a very different geostrategic situation. So the issue of how this will affect the Middle Eastern region is, of course, a very important one to us and globally. And I think one way to look at it is to look and see how the actors, the countries that are affected by this, or at least the key countries, because obviously we don't have the time to go through each and every Middle Eastern nation and look at it. But the ones that are interesting to us, and also the ones that are most impacted by it, we should probably get a little more acquainted with. So I would start with Iran, because I think Iran, along with Pakistan, is probably one of the two countries most affected by this issue of withdrawal. Now, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric from Iran about being very happy about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, obviously framing it as an American failure and as a success to resistance to American or foreign power in the region and so on. And there definitely is that side of it for Iran, because certainly Iran is engaged in a certain relationship with the United States, where it wants the United States off its borders. For sure, that's something that is positive, but we can't forget that one of the greatest things that the United States did for Iran under President Bush at the time was to take out the Taliban and take off their plate, one of their greatest at the time, enemies and adversaries. Let's not forget there's a very adversarial relationship between Iran and Afghanistan, the Taliban in the past, and some very bad blood around treatment of Shiite minorities in Afghanistan, in particular the Hazara minority that had suffered many atrocities, but not only that minority, there are various Shiite minorities in Afghanistan. And the approach that Iran is taking now is a much more positive approach, at least pro forma, towards Afghanistan. Certainly it's not trying to be in any kind of conflict or speaking against Taliban. On the contrary, there's some speaking of aid, and there's some, and of course, many refugees going from Afghanistan to Iran, and they're right on the border. So it's framed in a different way. But Iran, as well as all the other actors in the region, is really taking a wait and see policy towards the Taliban in the sense that we are currently still in a vacuum. We're not in a vacuum because Taliban has taken power, but we are in a vacuum as far as what the policies are and where this is going, because as you may or may not know, when the Taliban took power, they also took upon themselves certain commitments. There was also an agreement signed under Trump in February 2020 with the Taliban that is supposedly going to deal with its treatment towards terrorist organizations and won't harbor terrorist organizations and so on. There's a commitment to avoid sectarian conflict and to try and create an inclusive government. But all that is of course, speak, and everybody knows what the Taliban's history was. So the general attitude towards Afghanistan now under the Taliban is a wait and see policy, which is probably quite wise. And the same goes for Iran. I think a lot will, for Iran, pivot around the question of, is this going to revive the Shiite-Sunni divide? Are the Shiite minorities in Iran going to be mistreated? And taking it a step further, because everybody's looking at the Iranian temporary government and hoping it's not going to be the permanent one, but there's no way of knowing. Is there going to be an inclusive government? Is that inclusive government going to include Shiite minority? So a lot will pivot around how the Taliban actually treats it. And the other thing, of course, is terrorism, which, of course, Iran views a certain group as anti-Iranian. And we'll see what happens with Al-Qaeda under Taliban now, and so on. So Iran, like really all the other countries that are bordering Afghanistan, is concerned about lack of stability and Afghanistan returning to become just a hotbed for any terrorist organization. That's a concern I really think everybody shares. There's nobody, not Pakistan, not China, not Russia, that stands to benefit anything from sectarian conflict in Afghanistan. That's something that Iran shares as well. And it's also important to remember that this could be a hot flash situation for Iran in its relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is actually over the last few months not exactly turned a corner, but is looking more positive or less conflictual. And any kind of sectarian violence and conflict within Afghanistan could pit them against each other in a very direct way, which I don't think either country is particularly interested at this time in that kind. So I think for Iran, another huge issue just to pay attention to is refugees. It's not exclusively Iranian. Turkey has just as much of a problem, but Iran and Pakistan have obviously a huge flow of refugees. Mind you, the Iranian economy is in a very shabby situation, and having this influx of refugees can't really help. So we're looking at a situation that is also problematic. But generally speaking, I think Iran, aside from the sectarian issue, also is looking to create some sort of economic growth through opportunities in Afghanistan. And so for both Saudi and Iran, it will be less of an ideological thing and more of an economic interest that motivates them until, if sectarian violence breaks out. And so just moving along, I have to say something about the nuclear agreement in this context, can't be avoided. I don't know that there's going to be any kind of direct influence. Iran has always worked very hard to separate regional issues from the issue or any other external issues from the nuclear issue. It is very, very afraid of the kind of pressure that will be put on it in terms of its regional actions, its support of terrorism, certainly the missile issue and so on and so forth. So as far as the Iranians are concerned, they're going to work very hard to keep this out. And what will or could work for them in this is that it's an opportunity to get much closer to both China and Russia, who are already defending Iran and preventing a lot of movement on this issue of the nuclear deal. And we know, we're also party to negotiations last time. So in terms of cooperating with Russia and China in Afghanistan might help Iran against the United States and its allies in that sense. Now, Saudi is a very interesting issue in this as well, because Saudi Arabia, we talked about the United States pivoting out of the Middle East and towards Asia. And I would say Saudi Arabia is probably exemplifies the fear of moderate nations in the Middle East, of what will happen when the United States up and leaves. So Afghanistan is one stage. We're still looking at Iraq. We're still looking at Syria, parts of Syria. As small as the presence is, it's still there. And for Saudi, it really does seem that the United States right now is certainly not its exclusive, strong, or even primary ally the way it had been for a very long time. They're definitely engaging with Russia and trying to get all sorts of understanding with the Russians. Very involved with the Chinese. Certainly, I can tell you on the nuclear level, they're hiring many, many Chinese consultants on civilian nuclear issues, but we all know where that is headed. And of course, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have been close on many, many military issues for many years. That's not new. Pakistan is very close with China. So the movement out of the region by the United States is definitely causing Saudi to try and hedge against being alone vis-a-vis Iran or any kind of, Shiite arc and so on and so forth. So the Saudis are very careful with the way they're conducting themselves right now. And it's very interesting to note that Saudi Arabia, it's not the only one, but Saudi is interesting in this context, has not recognized the Taliban government, which the Taliban is pushing very hard to be recognized. And last time around, it did recognize the Taliban government very, very quickly. But the lesson was that geopolitical investment did not work out. And so Saudi is in no particular hurry to do that. Maybe one last country in the Middle East, or two to look at, but one closely is a little more closely is Qatar. I don't know, how do you say it in English? Qatar.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah, look, I'm British. I've heard Americans say it a different way, but I say Qatar. But
I'm Israeli. I say Qatar. So Qatar.
Let's go with that.
Right. As you may or may not, was very instrumental in the talks between the Taliban and the United States, which took place in Doha and is close to the Taliban. And so it's positioned in a way where it could actually capitalize on this relationship if the Taliban provides what everybody is hoping it will provide, or everybody's asking them to provide, which is a certain sense of stability and prevention of sectarian violence, and of course all the basic things that were called for in the UN Security Council that was passed on this matter, which are safe passage out of the country, and treatment of women and children and refugees, so on and so forth. So everybody's looking to see how that works, and if that works badly, that reflects very badly on Qatar and its ability to kind of wield more influence in the region, which is something that Qatar is very interested in. And the last thing, just to vaguely mention, is Turkey, just because of the refugee issue. Look, the refugee issue didn't start with Afghanistan, of course. We've been seeing, huge issues with refugees, the Syrian civil war and all of that. And Turkey is a gateway to Europe. And when Turkey decides to allow refugees out, then they get to Europe, and there are issues with that. So, and the discussion within Turkey about the refugees is escalating. It's becoming very negative because of the numbers, just the sheer numbers of refugees that Turkey is getting. Interestingly enough, China, which is a bordering country as well, isn't getting an influx of refugees because there's a very difficult corridor there, and it's just not a comfortable way to get through. So for China, it's not that kind of an issue. But for Turkey and Iran and Pakistan, it's a very strong issue, which they talk about in terms of national security. So those are all of those countries. And would you like me to talk about Israel now? That's that last one.
Yeah, sure. Let's go. Yes, let's focus on Israel now. Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting way in which this may or may not might not affect us. But maybe before Israel, I just want to mention that the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan is just a huge issue for Eurasia. It's not just the Middle East. I mean, we're talking about Central Asia, and we're talking about great power politics. And we're talking about China, Russia, and the United States, and in particularly, really, China and the United States here, how that will pan out. Now, the Chinese and the Russians have been very critical about how the United States withdrew. But I think the truth is, and I think President Biden may have touched on that in his speech, don't remember exactly, is that they probably would have been very happy if the United States stayed there forever, because the issue of stability is very, very important. And the issue of terrorism is very, very important for all of those countries. They all suffer from those kind of movements, and nobody wants to see the kind of Wild West that was there before in Afghanistan. So, but having said that, it's interesting to note that when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan and the UN resolution, the UN Security Council resolution went through, the Chinese and the Russians did not support it. They abstained. Now, it's interesting because it was there's nothing to disagree about. It was a very straightforward humanitarian call, safe passage, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to note that they, because they see that they have great interest in Afghanistan, and they don't, with the Taliban, and they don't want to kind of pose themselves in any kind of conflict vis-a-vis, that they did not support that resolution. But when asked about it, the Chinese always point to the fact that they abstained. They didn't vote against. So in other words, they're obviously keeping all their options open in looking at this issue. And I think it's important to note that for China, again, Afghanistan as a geopolitical issue, I don't think is a very large issue. It's more of the issue of terrorism and how investments might be affected. The way that China looks at foreign policy now, the focus that it has really is on economic growth and technology, and probably technology before economic growth. So it is engaged in an all-out competition with the United States over predominance in cyber and AI, artificial intelligence, and issues like Afghanistan. It's not that they don't factor in. China is a neighbor of Afghanistan and a close ally of Pakistan, but I would say they're definitely secondary or even peripheral. In those terms, I think this play is just interesting for the Chinese in terms of one more step that the United States has taken to capitalize on this pivot towards Asia and recognizing that China is probably its main adversary. And what?
Sorry, just before you get to Israel, just because I'm just staying on China for a second, and maybe this does actually play into Israel a little, so you can also include it in your Israel talk. But one of the criticisms, or one of the sort of attacks, quite partisan attacks, I guess, on Biden, because there's this sort of, game being played in a way in American politics between Democrats and Republicans about who's tougher on China and who's taking more seriously the China threat. One of the attacks was that because of Biden's the way that it was done and the decision to do it, I guess, like Taiwan will be looking at the situation and thinking, wait a minute, America's not going to come to our aid, and this could encourage China to do the thing that's been threatening for the past how many decades and actually invade Taiwan. And America's so-called guarantee of security guarantee won't mean anything, because look what happened with Afghanistan. But I'm wondering whether, given what you've said, actually the pivot to Asia means that America is actually more likely to be focusing on that, and therefore is that sorry if this upsets any Taiwanese who may be listening, but whether it's actually not good news for Israel and our allies in the Middle East if America is focusing all its energies in that part of the world.
Right. So So I think if you look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a global trend for the United States, then you would be concerned. But I think really, if you're closely following the geopolitics of it and who the United States has been marking it as its main competitor, and this is going on for a very long time, it is China. And the investment of, and it's been really stated more than once, that the divestment from the Middle East has to do with the need to have a stronger presence, or not necessarily physical presence, but stronger focus on what is the real competition, right? So the perception is, for a lot of people, we're stuck in this Middle Eastern quagmire, which isn't really a pivotal interest for us anymore because of the oil independence of the United States and the way that the energy market has changed and many other issues. And everywhere we step is just this quagmire, whereas the real battle is going on somewhere else, right? So I think if you are Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, you're not concerned about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The operational tempo and the personnel tempo of the military of the United States, which is going to be much improved because of its lack of presence in Afghanistan, will benefit it in places where it's invested elsewhere. But coming back to Israel, this is a very interesting and nuanced question. Because on the face of it, you would say, well, any kind of withdrawal from the Middle East is not good for Israel. And I got to say, I don't really support that view. Let's remember that the United States has not always been physically in the Middle East. I mean, it was before the Iraq War and so on. And I don't think the commitment to Israel was lesser because there weren't troops here, in particular in Iraq or elsewhere. I don't think the the physical location here is what matters for Israel. For other countries, it's very different. So that's what I mentioned about Saudi Arabia. For Saudi Arabia, it's critical. Saudi Arabia does not possess the same kind of capabilities that Israel possesses to protect itself. And it's right there. And the Israeli-Iranian conflict has been played out particularly by proxy wars and not by necessarily direct attacks. But if I put aside the issue of cyber wars, because cyber wars do directly attack the territories. So for Israel, it's a completely different set of tools. But the question for Israel is not the military presence of the United States, but the commitment. So if the region, the question is, if the region isn't important or isn't as important as it used to be, it's not critically important. And I think there is a big change here. You know, through many, many years when I was working government and vis-a-vis the United States, the code was that the vital interest is no hostile hegemon in Eurasia. And for that reason, the Middle East was very important. But now it's moved to Asia. So the importance of the region, does it affect Israel's importance? And there are two ways to look about it. So the simple way is to say, sure, if the region is less important, Israel is less important. But I think a more strategic way to look at it, and I do give President Biden points for being strategic, because this move is a strategic move, this withdrawal. And he was, you know, he said, you know, we're paying the price, but we're doing what needed to be done. So I think he's a very strategic thinker. If you're thinking about it strategically, if you are pivoting out of an area, you want to leave yourself a stronghold, and you want to leave it on terms that are making you stronger and allowing you some stability and some influence in the region, even though you're not there physically yourself. Just creating a vacuum, as we've seen in Afghanistan, really doesn't work very well. And I don't think that surprised. I think that the speed at which it happened surprised them, but I don't think the actual substance of what happened surprised them. So I think the understanding of being away from a region, that doesn't mean you don't need to have some strongholds there, and really not having Saudi as the same kind of location for bases and the same kind of strategic ally that it was for a very long time. It could be that Israel actually you know, will benefit from it, or at least doesn't really need to worry about it. And if I had to bet, I would say that's probably the right way to look at it. Certainly, if the importance of the region is declining, and it has been for a long time, it's important for Israel. Certainly, the question of, is this affecting the United States' willingness to intervene in Iran, is on the table with the nuclear issue. The United States is not showing the same kind of, at least rhetorically, the same kind of steadfast. We have not heard President Biden say, with regard to the nuclear agreement, all options are on the table, the way President Obama did, right? So there's a question mark. Does this mean something for how the United States will conduct itself vis-a-vis the nuclear issue? Certainly, those are issues that are very disconcerting for Israel. Another issue that Israel is looking at, and it seems peripheral, but it has some importance, is the issue of terrorist organizations. So this notion, it's being marketed as a big win against the United States. It's been marketed that way even by Al-Qaeda and by others. Will it embolden and influence other terrorist organizations that are anti-Israeli and target Israel? But the truth is that most of the organizations that Israel is dealing with are the counterterrorism strategies and policies don't really rely that much in the United States. The United States does not have a great role in this anti-terrorist fight in the sense that Israel is taking it on itself. It's supported and so on and so forth, but it's shouldering most of this effort. So that probably won't be a huge difference, but it's something that we really do have to keep an eye on, in particular because there are already reports, and they're not confirmed, and we won't know for a while, but that Hezbollah troops are already in Afghanistan and starting to train. And if this is the case, then of course it's worrisome, and it does have an effect on Israeli thinking, maybe in a more strategic way. But I think also one other issue that is important for Israel at this point, and this is very current, so I can't say it's a long-term strategic point, but the American presence in Syria, especially in eastern Syria, And then in Iraq, is it going to stay? Are they going away? Because for Israel, as you know, that's a very, very active arena, especially in Syria. And the Russians are, involved in this very, very strongly. And the Iranians have their hands everywhere. And right now, where the battle between Israel and Iran is playing out is in Syria, and to some extent in Lebanon, and in cyberspace, where we see a very, very active arena. So where the Americans aren't there at all, that does make an impact. And I do hope that at least in Syria, they will leave a certain presence. I don't think it would be very burdensome for the United States. And I do think that one of the issues for Israel and the United States is that no matter what happens in this arena of the nuclear talks, even if they, move along and it's desirable for the United States to keep the peace, that they understand that Israel has interests there outside of the nuclear issue that have to be addressed, and that Israel is given leeway to continue and deal with the threats on its borders from Syria and Lebanon, but that emanate from Iran.
Okay. I'm going to ask, we don't have questions yet, but I'm asking our audience to write questions into the chat. I'm going to ask one more question, and then hopefully we'll have some questions from you guys to put to Helit. I wonder if there's any sort of secondary consequence of this in terms of some of the Sunni Arab countries being encouraged to move closer to Israel as a result of their fears, maybe, of an American retrenchment. So you mentioned the Saudis. There was this very interesting meeting in Iraq of Sunni and maybe even some Shiite leaders who were sort of calling for peace with Israel. But I wonder, is that possible that they could sort of look and say, if we can't rely on the United States to be there to have our back, then really Israel is the go-to regional power to help us against the Iranian threat.
Right. So there are a couple of things that are in motion in this sense. The United States, Israel, and Saudi, and the Emirates, and basically the moderate Muslim nations in the region have had a correlation of interest around the Iranian issue for a very long time. But for a very long time, it hadn't materialized in any way, primarily because of the Palestinian issue. And when the Palestinian issue is stuck, it is very difficult for certainly Saudi Arabia, but also other nations to move ahead with substantial efforts to do something together strategically with Israel. Now, having said that, we've seen over the last few years, for example, the Abraham Accord, which have been very interesting in that sense. But again, they haven't been really strategic, or they're very they're focused on economics and cyber and joint interests and so on and so forth. And translating that into something military or strategic, I think is something that we can't expect in the immediate future. And mind you, if Saudi isn't on board this, then it's a big difference, because Saudi really is kind of a key player in this sense. Now, Saudi, as I said before, is really hedging against the United States disappearing from the region, or disappearing as its main ally and its main provider of security assurances. And again, I'm driving you towards the nuclear issue, but just because it's very evident, the lack of security has led them to take very enhanced actions in the field of nuclear energy. And they're not even making any particular efforts to hide that they are interested in hedging against an Iranian nuclear capability. And so in this sense, creating some sort of regional balance against Iran, whether it's nuclear or any other thing, is a reasonable position to take, but it's very, very hard to carry out. And I think probably the more likely possibility for something to occur would be some sort of regional cooperation of moderate, like-minded states in the region in creating not exactly a NATO, but some kind of pact or alliance. And it could even be supported by the United States or Europe in terms of its security assurances, because otherwise we're going to see very, very difficult proliferation scenarios of nuclear weapons within the Middle East. That includes Turkey, it includes Egypt, it includes Saudi, all of which are already deeply involved in looking for their own protection from an Iranian nuclear weapon. Now posing Israel as the central axis of that seems to me to be impossible. There's so much history and so much still contention around the Palestinian issue that I don't see that really materializing, certainly not in the near future. In a very long-term way, it is an interesting strategic choice. I mean, it's not without sense strategically, but carrying it out would be very difficult. Let's not forget, the Arab world is not where its leaders are. So the Abraham Accords, for example, are not particularly popular. Mind you, it's not all that different from the peace accords between Egypt and Israel in the late 1970s that still aren't very popular in Egypt in terms of public opinion. So the Arab world, I think, contrary to what some people think, does depend on its street and on public opinion. And taking such steps as creating some kind of axis around Israel seems to me to be a little too far-reaching, certainly as long as there's no advancements on the Palestinian track, and we don't expect that there will be anytime soon. Not that there will never come, but not right at this moment or in the next couple of years. It's not visible. So.
Okay. In the absence of questions, and I'm waiting for this, it's a quiet crowd tonight. But in the absence of that, I want to sort of take advantage of your expertise and being with us to maybe digress a little from the main point of this and just address a sort of wider issue regarding Israeli national security, which is that we've just had now the opening of the new Knesset. And there's a lot, things are being written about where the new government stands on all kinds of issues. Will it last? All those sorts of things. We're not going to get into those today, fortunately. But I am interested in your view on where you think this new government, and we can still call it somewhat a new government, especially after 12 years of one prime minister, where it's diverging from the Netanyahu era in terms of in its national security thinking. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to say that this government stands in any particular place, because it's such but truly it's such a puzzle and so many different, and they came together acknowledging and understanding and stating that this government has come together for other purposes. So the main issue, if the main issue that divides the Israeli public has been the Palestinian issue, even though some people say it doesn't interest people, but right and left on the issue of security issues or whatever, then in terms of that conflict or movement on that front, I don't see that any movement is going to be made or attempted even. I mean, that front is pretty much frozen inherently to begin with in a stated way. It's not something that people are skirting around, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a very big difference and a kind of consolidated policy, for example, on the nuclear issue, because I think on the nuclear issue, you see a Democratic president and a Democratic administration that absolutely is not being attacked by the Israeli government, that is taking its time and has made very little guarantees really towards Israel on where it will stand in this what's going to be offered in these nuclear negotiations and the talks, how is it going to deal with the fact that you can't really go back to the prior agreement because it doesn't exist anymore because of the United States withdrawal from the agreement and then consequent Iranian actions. So you really can't reverse that. What are you going to do, and so on and so forth. But the attitude of the Israeli government is to be inside the room with its counterparts in the United States and elsewhere and actually work in a policy way and try and get the points across and try and get as much information and push for what its interests are from inside the bureaucracies and inside the work that goes on, which is the complete opposite of what the Netanyahu, I want to say government did, but it wasn't so much Netanyahu government, it wasn't Netanyahu, it was his issue. And he basically refused to deal with anything to do with this deal. So Israel was completely out of the room. We all know there was a very adversarial relationship between him and President Obama, which didn't really work for Israeli interests. And then obviously the next thing was completely to attack this agreement. And I don't know if we can give Netanyahu the credit or whatever for Trump leaving the agreement, but the withdrawal from the agreement left us where we are now, which is in a very precarious position, right? And this Israeli government is not after the agreement. It doesn't really look at it in terms of this agreement is not a symbol for the Israeli government. It really is a very practical way of looking at trying to get assurances for the United States for what happens if the talks fail, trying to get assurances from the United States to secure Israeli interests outside of the nuclear issue, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a very big difference there. And I think if you looked at Bennett's speech in the United Nations, you could see the difference right there. It's not that he's any less concerned about the Iranian threat, and we're probably in a worse place in terms of the Iranian threat than we were a year ago and 2 years ago, because since 2019, they've started moving very, very quickly towards increasing their nuclear capacity, but it doesn't create from the Israeli government the same kind of, strong public relations aspect of getting up against the American administration.
What about the criticism that for all that Netanyahu's approach, obviously, as we know, created tensions with the American administration, that without that public display of hostility towards the deal, it makes it more difficult for Israel to in the case of Israel needing to act, that Israel would be more difficult having not made it known that Israel is so opposed to the deal.
Well, I think there was a logic along those lines when kind of the Israeli track started, where it was very believable before the sanctions were put in by the Obama administration, but also the EU. So the P5+1 at the time, that Israel was walking on two paths. It was basically saying, we're ready to go and do what we need to do if the world doesn't rally up and do what it needs to do, right? And that was done by building and showcasing a very strong preparation for a scenario of a military option. Now, I have to tell you, I'm very sad to say, I haven't seen any, if you're going to threaten military options, they have to be viable and credible. And let me promise you, they really were. The Americans were very worried that Israel would go and do something on its own before those sanctions were imposed. But that pillar of the strategy with which most people, I don't know if this is true, but attribute to Ehud Barak, because at the time it was Ehud Barak and was the Minister of Defense and Netanyahu was Prime Minister. So they really were walking that path very credibly. But that hasn't been the case in years and years. So Israel has put all of its eggs in the basket of an American attack. And now, is an American attack really on the table is a big question. Yeah. And the credibility of an Israeli attack, I have to say, unfortunately, to me, is not at the place that it was in 2010 or 2009 when, we spend $1 billion shekels a year preparing for this scenario. And made it known very clearly that we're doing that. And ever since, it's not really been something that we're at least is visible or has been discussed enough or has been present enough in the discussion so if you're going to walk that path, you've got to have the two options be very credible. And that requires a lot of investment. That was the case in the beginning, but then it stopped being the case after a while. And particularly, I think, when Trump was president, the thought or the understanding that when Trump became president, then an attack became more feasible, an American attack or an American military option. That was probably what was motivating it. But now it seems that we're left without Trump and not necessarily with a viable attack. I don't know. I don't want to say that. And I'm sure that that's not the case in terms of zero, right? But it's not at that level of visibility and viability that we would have wanted to see in order for it to become a very credible threat again. And that's a result of many years of a different policy. So you can't just talk, you got to do if you want to be credible in this scene. Right.
Okay, I'm gonna give our audience one last chance, my friends, to ask a question of Helit before we go. I'm going to ask a question, one last question, Helit, and then we'll see if we get any questions from the audience. We talked about you talked about terrorism earlier, and there was this, in Afghanistan, obviously the original pretext for the American attack was 9/11 and Al Qaeda being present there. Do you think that the return of the Taliban, and as you mentioned, Hezbollah reportedly are there, could this potentially, this move and the return of the Taliban, could it potentially spark a major renewal of the jihadist movements in the Middle East that seem to have been, if not entirely defeated, then certainly very much diminished by the defeat in Syria and in most of Syria, at least, and in Iraq? Is the Taliban regime, the return of the Taliban, going to spur on the return of this kind of activity in the Middle East?
Right, and that I think is really probably the main concern of most countries involved in this is the Taliban going to resume its role in the past as fostering certain terrorist groups and collaborating with them and so on and so forth, or will it stand to its commitment and public statements, which has made, where this territory will not become a hotbed for hostilities against other countries? And that's something that they've said, along with other statements such as avoidance of sectarian conflict and avoidance of and promising an inclusive government. Now, we haven't seen them stand up to any of those commitments yet, and that is the big question that is stated, and that we'll have to wait and see. Does it potentially embolden terrorist organizations? We'll have to wait and see, because on the face of it, it should give them some sense of, certainly Al Qaeda has tried to paint this as a victory for them, and certainly if it emboldens these organizations, we'll have to wait and see. As far as actual support for these organizations, so let's say increased support from Iran to those terrorist organizations, which has supported over many, many years. Look, they don't have the money. So it's, once Napoleon was asked, why didn't you bomb Russia? And he said, I didn't have cannons. So it's that kind of thing where if they don't have the ability, or not zero ability, but we all know Iran is in a very, very difficult situation. Now, mind you, so is Kabul. It's very important to notice. Taliban has taken over, and they're about to lose all power in the country because they haven't paid their electrical bills to Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and other countries around them that are supplying them with electricity. And they have now applied for humanitarian aid to the UN for $90 million that should be paid on behalf of them so that people can continue to have electricity in Kabul. So understand that they are in a very precarious position. They are currently very, very actively seeking recognition, which they haven't gotten for most nations, and seeking to, at this point, they're putting forth their nicest face, the Taliban are, right? Their nicest face, and they're trying to get everybody to recognize them, and they're promising things about terrorism, and they're promising things about inclusive government and so on and so forth. But it's very hard for people in Iran. They're very strong voices say you can't trust the Taliban. And I would like to make the point, because I really can't talk about Afghanistan without mentioning the gender issue. You know, we've heard promises about women, but meanwhile, there's a temporary government that has absolutely not just that it has no women in it, but it has a lot of the old guard of the Taliban from the 1990s that was highly involved in action against women and against the United States and so on and so forth. So we see the face that they're trying to put forward and what they're actually doing right now. So they made statements that women will be able to go back to work, but then they've also made a statement that women can't work alongside with men. So what's that going to look like? So how far along can you go with these statements? So the Taliban is not in an easy position, because this time around, things have changed for Pakistan, which is a supporter or a close ally of them, Doha, Qatar, Iran, you know, all of those countries around them are invested in stability right now in terms of Afghanistan. So they're taking these issues. Now, I have to mention on the gender issue one more thing. They have stated, because they were criticized for the government that's an all-male government, and said, we're certainly not the only government in the Middle East is an all-male government. And that's, you know, that's another point. Like how much can you push for gender in from the Taliban when it's not exactly number one, not in Iran, not in Saudi, as an issue, right? So of course the Taliban is a completely different measure of anti-women, but this is a very, very complex issue. The world is watching. And right now they need the world for money. They need the world for recognition. So they're walking a tightrope. They haven't gotten what they want yet. As soon as you start playing the game of legitimacy, and they want to be a legitimate, they want to be recognized as a legitimate power. And look, Trump gave them some legitimacy because he negotiated with them and he signed an international agreement with them. That legitimizes them and gives them some power. They have to play the international game. They're looking for aid from the United Nations. They have to play the international game. And that means inclusiveness for minorities and women. So we'll have to wait and see. And that's my main message. We're in a wait and see situation here.
Yeah, I mean, they did say, of course, didn't they, that they'll you know, protect women's rights with a rather important caveat that it would be within Islamic law, with their interpretation of Islamic law being what it is. We shouldn't hold our breath for sort of, you know, women being equal in any sense that we would understand it. We do have a question here very specifically about the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan. And just actually to add on to that, wasn't it the case that far from Taliban supporting or sheltering ISIS, weren't ISIS or a local franchise of ISIS responsible for a terrorist attack against Afghan authorities in the airport or something?
Yeah, yes, I believe that's true. As far as I know, they're very much at odds. It's interesting because I remember when ISIS, first of all, ISIS is, you know, I don't want to say completely non-existent, but ISIS has been cut down significantly. ISIS right now is not, you know, a very strong power, but when ISIS was at its strongest, it was definitely adversarial and in direct conflict with Al-Qaeda, which Al-Qaeda was close with Taliban. So, you know, Al-Qaeda used to say about ISIS, oh, they're crazy. You know, that's what it was like. So, yeah, no, I don't see ISIS in Afghanistan reviving. I actually don't see anything reviving that particular organization, because the level of atrocities that were carried out brought actual boots on the ground action against them. And that was they really were very strong as long as nobody was around, as opposed to Taliban. But also Taliban, you see, they were very strong when nobody was around. As soon as the United States went away, Taliban became very strong again. So yeah, no, I don't see it particularly as an ISIS situation.
Here's a question. Are there any Jews in Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Jews in Afghanistan, you know, I don't think so. There are Jews in Iran, we know, right? But
right, of course.
I think there used to be Jews in the Baluchistan area in Afghanistan, but I have to say, I'm not sure about that. That's a very interesting question. Sorry, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll say thank you very much to Helit for her time. Thank you all for joining. I think it's been a really enlightening conversation and brought a different angle to this topic, which so much has been written about it, but not really from the perspective of Israel and the Middle East. So we thank you, Helit Barel, very much for returning to the Begin Center Zoom and educating us about that. Thank you, Helit. Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you're not on my email list, then drop me an email, paulg@begincenter.org.il. We're going to start a series from next week, a few discussions with different experts talking about Israel, Israel and Asia, looking at Israel's relations with India and China and others. So we will do that next week. So if you want to get the details for that, you can go to our website or Facebook or email me, as I said, paulg@begincenter.org.il. People are now informing us on the chat that the last Jew of Afghanistan left a couple of weeks ago. So there you go. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, everyone. Have a great evening and a great day.